Hey, welcome back, everybody. Happy Monday. Today we are starting to take a look at the causes of the Civil War. We watched that video after the test last week. Now we're going to get into the details here today. If you haven't downloaded the notes sheet that goes along with that, you should do that at this time. You can find it right here in the calendar. Otherwise, you can go ahead and get it in Schoology as well. And this is what it looks like. We're going to be completing this entire document here today, and you will turn it in at the end of this lecture. All right, let's get to it. See if this will let me full screen here. And we're going to start today with an intro. We got this intro video here, maybe. Yes. So go along and make sure you're answering that question. First question in the pink box after this video is over. Here we go.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, from Val Verde, New Mexico, and Tullahoma, Tennessee, to St. Albans, Vermont, and Fernandina on the Florida coast. More than 3 million Americans fought in it, and over 600,000 men, 2% of the population, died in it. American homes became headquarters. American churches and schoolhouses sheltered the dying, and huge foraging armies swept across American farms and burned American towns. Americans slaughtered one another wholesale here in America, in their own cornfields and peach orchards, along familiar roads and by waters with old American names. In 2 days at Shiloh, on the banks of the Tennessee, more American men fell than in all previous American wars combined. At Cold Harbor, 7,000 Americans fell in 20 minutes. Men who had never strayed 20 miles from their own front doors now found themselves soldiers in great armies, fighting epic battles hundreds of miles from home. They knew they were making history, and it was the greatest adventure of their lives. The war made some rich, ruined others, and changed forever the lives of all who lived through it. A lackluster clerk from Galena, Illinois, a failure in everything except marriage and war, who in 3 years would be head of the Union Army, and in 7, President of the United States. An eccentric student of theology and military tactics, a hypochondriac who rode into battle with one hand raised to keep, he said, the blood balanced. A college professor from Maine who, on a little hill in Pennsylvania, ordered an unlikely textbook maneuver that saved the Union Army and possibly the Union itself. 2 ordinary soldiers, one from Providence, Rhode Island, the other from Columbia, Tennessee, who each served 4 years, and together seemed to have been everywhere during the war, and lived to tell the tale. The courtly, unknowable aristocrat who disapproved of secession and slavery, yet went on to defend them both at the head of one of the greatest armies of all time. The runaway boy who stole himself from slavery, recruited 2 regiments of black soldiers, and helped transform the Civil War into a struggle for the freedom of all Americans. And then there was the rough man from Illinois, who would rise to be the greatest president the country has ever seen. Between 1861 and 1865, Americans made war on each other and killed each other in great numbers, if only to become the kind of country that could no longer conceive how that was possible. What began as a bitter dispute over Union and states' rights ended as a struggle over the meaning of freedom in America. At Gettysburg in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said perhaps more than he knew. The war was about a new birth of freedom.
All right. right. So go ahead and answer that question if you haven't already. What sticks out most to you from that intro there? So we've talked about some of these things already as we're going to go through, but hopefully this will build on the information you learned from that video last week. When we talk about the nation starting to divide up, it really is going to start with this idea of states' rights. And while this is not the main cause of the war, it starts with this story. And now the fight over what should the federal government want versus what states should they get what they want, this has been here since the foundation of our country. We've talked about this already, those differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. You go all the way back even to the 1790s, and there's talk of already of states refusing to follow certain laws because they don't feel like it fits for them. So you could look into the details of things like the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and the attempt to nullify or just refuse to follow a federal law if they don't feel like it fits in with their state. So this has happened several times already by the time we get to the Civil War. Happened again with 1812. The Federalists actually talked about leaving the country after it was after we declared war on Great Britain in the War of 1812. It happens again in 1832. As this build up to the Civil War is already happening, President Andrew Jackson is going to sign a tariff act. It's all about taxes. And some southern states don't want to pay these taxes, so they refuse to follow it. And he's going to shut that down with military troops, sending in the military to enforce that law. And so the testing of states trying to see if they really have to follow federal law or not, that's been there from the beginning of our country. And that's where this conversation starts. Who should be setting these laws, states or the federal government? Now, as we build up to the Civil War itself starts in 1861, but for several decades ahead of time, the tension was building for a number of reasons. And so we're going to kind of go through what these reasons are today. So the first one here is sectionalism. Sectionalism is this idea of us pushing and having our different parts of the nation and starting to push that idea west. So about 1820 or so, we have this idea of what's called manifest destiny. And it's really this idea that we have the right to expand wherever we want. That if you can take over an area, if you can control an area, you should get to keep it. That becomes a fundamental part of a lot of Americans during this time period, especially as so many lands are opening now west of the Mississippi River. More and more states are being added all the time during this time period. And the U.S. as a nation is starting to grow and take control and dominance over these areas. President James Monroe is going to really declare this idea that America is kind of in charge of the Western Hemisphere in his Monroe Doctrine. And the U.S. is going to gain this confidence and really this entitlement that if we can control it, we should. And so you have, as these new territories are being settled and as you have more and more people moving west, it gets to a point where a lot of these places are starting to become states. And so the question really starts to come up, should this state be allowed to have slavery or not? In the North, a lot of the northern states did not want slavery. And we should be clear, it's not because they were abolitionists. It's not because they wanted to end slavery. It's because in the North, you had a lot of industrial jobs. And if you allowed slavery, that took jobs away from those immigrants that were coming into the nation that came here looking for jobs. So it's not like they wanted slaves to be free. It's just they didn't want slaves to take their jobs as immigrants were coming in. In the South, they very much wanted slavery. They had created this belief that slavery was intertwined with their economy, and without it, they would be destroyed. They felt like their slaves were their property, and their property, they should be able to keep that. So at this point, slavery is not a huge issue. It's still very divided. That's sectionalism. North wants one thing, South wants the other, and it's kind of just surviving that way for right now. But this idea of manifest destiny is going to be one that we come to time and time again. You can see in the picture there of the the woman coming across here, really symbolizing people moving west. And it's this idea of American coming across the nation. If you look at the details, you can see people pushing west, but you can also see, look at the light move with her, right? Everything in front of her is dark, right? America, she represents America. America comes, right? And with her, she brings the light. She brings industry, right? You can see the railroad kind of following after her as well. She's bringing change. And the idea is when America pushes west, it brings all these great new revolutions with it. So in 1820, then, just about this time as people are moving west, we have our first major compromise when it comes to slavery. It's called the Missouri Compromise. This is just a short-term fix, but really, literally, what they do is they draw a border line along one of the latitude lines, and they say, if you're above this line, you're a free state. If you're below this line, you're a slave state. The one compromise there is, of course, Missouri. You can see it in this map here, and we'll see it in this video. This video will tell you more.
In 1819, representation in the Senate was equally balanced between states that allowed slavery and states that prohibited it. But as territories that had been acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase began to apply for statehood, one question came up. Would they join with the slave states or the free states? Missouri's application for admission to the Union threatened to tip the delicate balance in the Senate and sparked the first of many national debates about slavery. Northern politicians immediately called for the Missouri Territory to free its slaves as a condition for entering the Union.
And so you get this major divide between the North and the South, the biggest one that had ever occurred since the creation of the Constitution, where they had settled certain issues over slavery. Well, the Missouri Compromise brings it all back up.
When James Talmadge, a New York representative, put forth an amendment suggesting gradual emancipation for Missouri slaves, Southerners were outraged. Not only did Southerners in Congress want Missouri to join their ranks as a slaveholding state, they didn't want the federal government deciding what a state should do regarding slavery. The nation's first major debate on slavery had begun. In the North, religious reformers organized anti-slavery rallies, bringing their cause to the forefront of national politics. And in the South, the word secession was uttered for the first time. But almost as soon as it had begun, the conflict ended with the Missouri Compromise.
Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House at the time, gets most of the credit for that. Because of this compromise and a couple others, he becomes known as the Great Compromiser.
Clay guided a bill through the Senate declaring that Missouri would come into the Union as a slave state, but the northern state of Maine would also be admitted as a free state, maintaining the tenuous balance in the Senate. As part of the Missouri Compromise, Congress took the line along the southern boundary of Missouri and extended it west across the remainder of the territories in the Louisiana Purchase. Then Congress declared that slavery would be permitted south of that line, but banned north of it. The slavery issue had been settled for the moment, but many, like ex-President Thomas Jefferson, predicted that the Missouri debate signaled a crisis that would eventually tear the country apart. This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror, he wrote to a friend. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union.
All right. So with the Missouri Compromise, we have this temporary fix on things, right? And it's all about keeping the balance. Within Congress, they wanted the same amount of free states as they have of slave states. And what that does is it doesn't make one more dominant than the other, which allows us to prolong this thing that's eventually going to be a problem. But we see the tension tick up already here in 1820. So you can see here's a great map of what this looks like. The nation has expanded at this point. We are entering more states, adding more states in all the time. So there is an equal number of slave states, which are the red ones, and free states, which are the green ones there, with lots more unorganized territory to later be added. Also keep in mind yet we do not have the rest of the nation yet. That's still under Spanish control, but that will change very soon here. So by 1848, we are looking to continue that idea of expanding. That idea of manifest destiny continues to grow, and a couple things are happening in the 1840s. One, you have the Spanish-American War. This is a war between us and Mexico, in which we are going to gain a lot of territory. You can see it there in the map. Basically, everything. This was Spain. This was kind of the territory that we were fighting over, right? But in the war, by winning the war, we're actually going to get all of this territory claimed to us in this war. This was a really controversial war. There are a lot of people that did not believe that we should be even fighting this war at all. And it's going to continue to create more controversy because now we have a ton more territory, a lot of it in the south, to expand and grow into. About that same time in 1848, the gold rush happens. And so you have now we've talked about this briefly in our immigration unit, we have tons of people now moving west all the way to the coast here looking for that gold. That's going to cause the population of California to boom really, really quickly. So we only get this territory in 1848. By the next year with the discovery of gold, we already see that California is trying to organize itself as a state as the population grows. Their state Congress is going to pass a constitution and they want to enter the nation as a free state. That's going to cause another problem. By bringing another free state into the nation, that creates an imbalance again. They're trying to keep that balance as much as possible. All right, so this is going to lead to another compromise. We call it the Compromise of 1850. And so this, again, you have Congress trying to figure out how do we kind of give the North and the South both a little bit of what they want. The simple aspect here is that the North is going to get California to enter as a free state. The South is going to get something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And we're going to let this video talk about that a little bit.
Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Compromise of 1850. In 1850, things are way more complicated than before because it's the aftermath of the Mexican War with the acquisition of territory in the West in an era of great sectional strife. This is right after the gold rush in California of 1849, and there's an awful lot of pressure over what to do about admitting a state in the West that doesn't have a history of slavery and might alter the sectional balance between slave and free states in the U.S. Senate. And in January of 1850, a senator named Henry Clay, who's famous as a compromiser in American history, he offered a package of proposals to try to adjust the sectional debate between the country over this issue. And the debate in the Senate was fierce and intense, some of the most dramatic scenes in American history. And they turned over the architecture, the engineering of this compromise package to Stephen Douglas, a younger senator from Illinois, a Democrat. And Douglas decided that the only way to get enough support for all of the different elements of the compromise was to break it apart and treat it separately. When it achieved final form as a series of separate bills in the fall of 1860, there were only 5 bills. One was about the admission of California as a state, a free state. One was about the organization of the Southwest Territories, New Mexico and Utah, without regard to slavery. One was about the adjustment of the border with Texas and New Mexico. One was about the elimination of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And the 5th and final bill, and most important for Southerners, a tougher federal fugitive slave law. Afterwards, enough people were relieved that they felt like they had achieved a kind of compromise, but most historians realize it was a shaky one at best. And even though it appeared for a couple of years that it would succeed, very quickly the fabric of the so-called Compromise of 1850 fell apart.
And that's what we get time and time again with these compromises, is they're short-term fixes, because the root of the problem is not whether states can have slaves or not. The root of the problem is the slavery itself. The fact that the South believes that their economy is built upon slavery and that they feel entitled to keep those slaves. But because of that, it is very much the root of this problem. And until we address the root of the problem, none of this is going to work. All right, so here is what the Compromise of 1850 is going to do. As the nation continues to expand, we can see the difference between 1820 now and 1850. So the nation now is going coast to coast. We've got California as a free state. Utah and New Mexico are organized as official territories. Oregon also official territories. And we've added a few more states in the Midwest as well. And then we still have that Great Plains region that is relatively unsettled still at that point. All right, now, as things ramp up in 1850 for the next few years, it kind of felt like maybe it would be okay, at least for a while. But with the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, we're going to see a huge boom in the South's reliance on slavery, making it even harder for them to let go of this idea that they rely on slave labor to make money. So we call this king cotton, that top crop in the South, really going to ramp up in this time period. So traditionally, the South has really relied on some other crops, tobacco, rice, and cotton as well. But it felt like for a while they were not making as much money off of those. They were all of those things are very labor intensive work. But when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, cotton is going to take over, because what the cotton gin is going to do, and you can see in this image down here, you see the cotton right here, it's got all these seeds in it. Well, you just crank it through this machine, and you can see it takes the seeds out and leaves this nice clean cotton on the other side. So they, like 100 times as much cotton as they could get through every day, versus having to pick those seeds out one by one. Very labor intensive, difficult to make any money. But this invention alone is going to change all of that and make it really, really easy to get a lot of cotton very quickly. At this point, only 25% of the South owned slaves, right? Though most in the South still supported it. Slaves were expensive. They equate one slave being similar to owning a car today. And so to own 2 or 3 or a dozen or 100 slaves is very, very expensive. It's a very high investment. Most Southerners still support slavery, however, because the slaves are being used to support their Southern economy. And so even if they don't have slaves directly, maybe they'll hire out the slaves from someone else as a day laborer, or else maybe they just naturally benefit from the use of slaves in their area. In the North, it's also very important to note that the North is benefiting from slavery as well, right? We've got this market revolution, we've got the increase, just kind of the start of that industrial revolution and factories and stuff like that starting. And a lot of those early factories have to do with textiles, which is cloth. Right? What do you need to make cloth? You need cotton. And a lot of their cotton was coming from the South. And so while they were not owning slaves themselves, they were using the cotton picked by slave labor in the South. And so the Northern market revolution, Northern industry was also creating that demand for increased cotton, which also intuitively created that demand for more slaves in the South. So looking at just the growth of slavery in this time building up to the 1860s, if you look at each one of these states in the South, take a look at proportionately their populations. So that teal color would be the white population. The blue color would be the slave population. Now there's some states like Kentucky and Tennessee where overwhelmingly a lot of the people are white. Missouri. But then take a look at places like Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana or South Carolina. And you have some areas where most of the people that live there are slaves. And so that's a dominating factor that slavery is entrenched into this economy, and the South is basically willing to do whatever they have to hang on to this. So coming back to sectionalism, now that we're a little bit further on in the 1850s, in the 1850s, hold on just a second, sorry about that. As we get into the 1850s here, with the passing of that fugitive slave law, we have a rise in abolitionism. A lot of people in the North in particular are starting to really analyze this idea of slavery as a moral issue. Also as a financial issue, as far as taking jobs away, as it always has been an issue. But as we get into the 1850s, we see more and more and more people pushing against slavery as being something that just morally isn't wrong. This isn't the only thing that's happening at this time. We also have a push for women's rights during this time period. We also have a push for workers' rights during this time period. And so abolition becomes kind of part of this overall movement, analyzing the morals of our nation and deciding, is this who we want to be? The federal government, however, going into the 1850s is not seriously thinking about ending slavery, or really not thinking about slavery at all. They kind of had felt like they had fixed the issue, at least temporarily, with that compromise of 1850. But it's the people in their everyday lives that are starting to ask questions about, why is this happening? And especially with that fugitive slave law for people in the North, they now were legally responsible to turn in runaway slaves. If they did not turn in runaway slaves, they could be arrested. That was a problem for people because a lot of them didn't want to turn in runaway slaves, but at the same time, they didn't want to be arrested. So it kind of put them in this tough spot, which is going to motivate them to just want to end slavery completely. So the South, seeing this and seeing more and more people in the North talk about it, even though the government's not doing anything to change it right now, the South is going to start shrinking away more and more. They're going to start assuming that eventually the North is going to push and try to get rid of slavery altogether. And so we start to see them shrink away and start to separate themselves more and more and more. Culturally, we have big changes as well. A woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to write this iconic book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is the second highest purchased book of this time period, second to only the Bible. So it's a widespread novel. It's a story. It's fictional, but showing her interpretation of what the daily life of a slave is. Right? Now, she was a young woman at the time. She was from a northern state. She didn't have a lot of experience with slavery, but based on what she had heard and what she had seen, she wrote this book. And it really caught on to showing just how terrible slave life could be and the difficult, destructive situation that it was for the slaves themselves, kind of putting a personal, emotional feeling to it in a way that no one else had up until this point. So culturally, this anti-slavery movement, abolitionism is what that is, starts to grow. Right? Then in 1854, we have another attempt at a compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska region was looking to enter the Union, and so out of a need to really compromise whether they should be slave or free, they decided to try something different. They're going to do something called popular sovereignty. What that means is they're going to let the people vote. Right? So whoever lives in that state gets to vote and decide, is it going to be a free state or a slave state? Unfortunately, what happened is once they announced that, all the extremists from both sides moved to those areas. So you have all the people that are willing to do anything to keep slavery moving, all the people that are willing to do anything to end slavery moving there, and the extremes of both. Now they're all living in the same place, and violence erupts. It gets the nickname Bloody Kansas, as you have citizens turning on each other and legit just murdering each other in the streets, conducting raids. It's just mass chaos, and a terrible, terrible situation for sure. In response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a brand new political party is going to form. They're going to call themselves the Republican Party, and they're actually going to form here in Wisconsin, sign their first charter in a place called Ripon, Wisconsin. Maybe you've been there. And so the Republican Party was really strongly standing on this idea of not allowing slavery to spread to any new areas. All right, we're getting closer to war here. So here is what that Kansas-Nebraska Act does. You can see the blue states are those slave areas. The green are the free areas. And those territories are really what is still being determined. Kansas in particular, right here, is going to see a brunt of the violence as those extremists on both sides are coming in. All right, as we get into the later 1850s, we really just see everything get more and more and more intense as we get closer to war. It starts in Congress, where a senator by the name of Charles Sumner is actually beaten on the floor by another congressman. And so you can see that image there of what that looked like. And so just legit violence is breaking out on the floor of the Senate, actually, I believe it was. And in response, those that were supporting the South start handing canes, sending canes, and supporting this idea of violence. You have congressmen and senators that start like legit bringing weapons to work every day just in case that violence breaks out. Then we have a Supreme Court case called the Dred Scott case. And the Dred Scott case, here you can see an image of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave. His master had moved north, and he had Dred Scott and his family was living several years as a slave in the north because his owner had brought him up. He eventually, after his master died, he's going to sue for his freedom, claiming he lives in the north, he lives in a free state, he should be free. After several years, that's going to make it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, they're basically going to decide that it never should have been a court case in the first place, that Dred Scott was a slave. He had no right to sue anybody. It could have been left right there and done, but actually Chief Justice Taney took it a step further and really said also that in addition to the fact that he never could have sued in the first place, Dred Scott was property. And so therefore, just like anything else, when you move your property. So when you move your slave being property, you should be able to move anywhere you want. The reason why this is a big deal is this essentially means that people can move anywhere they want with their slaves. There are no such thing as free states anymore. Maybe you can't buy a slave in a free state, but you can move there with your slaves according to the Supreme Court. And so therefore it gets just 3 or 4 years out from Civil War here, it gets rid of really this idea of what is a free state and what is a slave state. People are now free to move into free states with their slaves. This comes to another huge breaking point in 1859 when a man by the name of John Brown, you can see this image of him here, this tornado in the background, he's going to make a stand. He's going to try and really start a civil war. And so we will watch this video on John Brown. Oh no, it's not found. Well, that's weird because I found it last night. Maybe the link's weird. All right, I'll just tell you about John Brown. John Brown was a man that kind of bounced around a lot of places throughout his life, and it came upon him that he felt called by God to really ramp up this idea of slavery, to try and do something to bring this issue to the forefront once again. And so what he does is he goes down to Virginia, this place called Harper's Ferry, and he tries to start a revolt. He gathers up all these weapons with his sons and a few other slaves in the area, and he really thinks that all the slaves around Harper Ferry will rise up and kind of turn on their masters, and they'll start this massive slave revolt that will eventually turn into war and cause this whole thing to just be over with. It doesn't go like that at all. When you look at the logistics of how slavery works, there just were a lot of slaves that weren't really willing to risk that to rise up, and we can talk about that another time about what that means. But in the end, John Brown is arrested and hanged for his crimes. It becomes a huge spectacle. It divides the nation. Some people are really looking at him as a martyr, others looking at him as a traitor, trying to overthrow the government. So this is a lot of stuff, you guys. But this is the situation going into, if there isn't enough going on, there's a presidential election here in 1860. And with this presidential election, we're going to see everything that had building, all these tensions, all these compromises, all this destruction building. And it's going to be this election that's just like that final straw that causes the whole tower to topple down. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president along party lines. He is elected as a Republican, and with that, people assume he's going to try to end slavery everywhere. Now, he never actually said that. In fact, Lincoln really wasn't even for ending slavery everywhere. He didn't think constitutionally he had the right to end slavery as president. He definitely did not want to see it expand anywhere else, anywhere new, but there wasn't a ton of talk for him early on about ending it everywhere. That's going to come halfway through the war that he starts thinking about that. But with the election of a Republican president, many states start to secede. South Carolina is going to be the first. And they're doing that because they feel like their government is not representing them. Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in several states in the South. And so if you can imagine, the guy wasn't even a choice, and then he's elected president, that really does turn people away. So you can see the election results here. Every single state in the North, now there's several guys running, there's 4 different guys running. Our party system is kind of in shambles at this point because of the slavery issue. But you can see Lincoln is dominating the higher population areas of the North at that time. In the South, it's a little more divided. If you see the slave states, they're much more divided over who they want. So because of that division, they're going to lose, right? Because of that. So going into that, we do have secession. So everything in dark blue is going to really secede, really before Lincoln even becomes president. Those 7 states are going to secede. And then after the fall of Fort Sumter, that first battle that happens really shortly after Lincoln takes the oath of office and becomes president, you have those additional states enter. It is important to note, and we'll talk about the border states going forward, but these border states, these are slave states that actually choose to remain loyal to the North, and they are going to be very, very key in the North, the Union winning this in the long run. All right, guys, that was a lot of information. I tried to get through it as quickly as I could with you. If you missed anything, please note it in your notes and bring it to class tomorrow, and we'll talk about it. You should have all of those pink sections filled out. If you don't, pause or go back if you need to and finish that up. But you will then, once that's done, submit that note sheet in today. That is due today. And then tomorrow when I see you, we'll go through and answer any questions that you have. All right, thanks, guys. Have a great day. See you Tuesday.